The clock struck midnight, and the world outside erupted into fireworks and cheers. Inside our living room it was warm and cozy. The Christmas tree lights flickered softly, and the faint scent of cinnamon and pine lingered in the air. I stood with a glass of champagne in hand, smiling as the television played the countdown from Times Square. My husband Daniel had just been by my side, arm around my waist, whispering that he loved me. Felt perfect. Too perfect, perhaps. But then he excused himself. "Be right back," he murmured, brushing a kiss against my temple before slipping away. I thought nothing of it at first. The champagne bubbles danced on my tongue as I watched our friends laugh and toast to the new year. Through the sliding glass door I caught a glimpse of Daniel stepping onto the balcony, his phone in hand. He closed the door behind him, muffling the sound of the revelry. Something about it felt off. The way he glanced back before stepping out. The way he angled his shoulders, his free hand in his pocket. Curious, and perhaps a little tipsy, I wandered closer, champagne glass still in hand. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. Truly I didn't. But the muffled words carried through the glass, and when I heard his voice, low and warm, my breath caught in my throat. "I want to be with you," he said. My heart stopped. "This year will be ours. I promise." The glass in my hand trembled. The laughter inside the house faded into white noise. I stared at him through the reflection on the glass door. His face lit faintly by the glow of the city lights beyond. His expression was soft, tender in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. My Daniel, my husband of 7 years, was speaking those words to someone else. Who? He hung up the phone seconds later, slipping it into his pocket and turning back inside. I froze, panic rising in my chest. When he stepped back into the living room, he was smiling as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just shattered my world in those fleeting moments. He wrapped an arm around me and pulled me close, kissing my temple once more. I tried to smile, tried to match his energy, but my heart was pounding too hard, my mind racing too fast. Later that night, after the last guest had left and the house had fallen quiet, I asked him. I didn't plan to, but the words spilled out before I could stop them. "Who were you talking to on the balcony earlier?" I kept my voice light, almost playful, but I watched him closely. His body stiffened just for a moment, but enough for me to notice. "Just a colleague," he said smoothly. "She was calling to say Happy New Year. You know how it is with work, sometimes it never stops." He chuckled, taking a sip of his drink, and then kissed me on the forehead. "Nothing to worry about, love. A colleague. At midnight. On New Year's Eve. Telling her he wanted to be with her?" I didn't press him further that night. I didn't know why. Maybe I was scared of the truth, scared of what I might unravel if I pulled at the threads. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it took root quickly. Over the next few days I watched him more closely. I noticed the way he kept his phone face down on the table, the way he seemed to guard it as if it held the answers to every question I was too afraid to ask. One afternoon, when he was in the shower, I finally gave in to the gnawing curiosity. I unlocked his phone. It was easy. He never changed his passcode, and scrolled through his messages, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the device. Most of it was mundane. Work emails. Group chats with friends. But then I found it. Her. Her name was Rachel. At first, the messages seemed innocent enough. Work-related. Brief. But as I scrolled further back, the tone shifted. There were inside jokes. Late-night conversations. And then photos. Smiling selfies of her sent at odd hours. A photo of them together at a cafe I didn't recognize. And finally, his responses. "I miss you. I can't stop thinking about you. When can we meet again?" My stomach turned. My breathing became shallow. My vision blurred with tears, but I kept scrolling, desperate to understand the scope of this betrayal. I opened his calendar next. Hidden among the work meetings and gym sessions were events with her name. Lunch at a downtown restaurant. A movie I had begged him to see with me, but he had claimed he was too busy for. Coffee dates. And there, just 2 days before New Year's Eve, an entry that read, "Rachel Hotel 7 p.m. My chest tightened, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. The weight of it was crushing. Every memory of the past year felt tainted now, every kiss, every "I love you," stained with his lies. I put his phone down and walked to the bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection. Who was I? How had I not seen this coming? How long had he been slipping away from me while I clung to the illusion of our perfect marriage? That night I didn't confront him. I couldn't. I lay awake beside him, my back to his, tears soaking my pillow. His breathing was steady, peaceful, as if he didn't have a care in the world. Meanwhile, my world was crumbling around me, and he didn't even notice. The next morning I started planning. I wasn't sure what exactly: revenge, maybe, or escape. But one thing was certain. I couldn't live like this. Not anymore. The days that followed felt like a surreal blur. A hazy mix of anger, heartbreak, and numbness. I went through the motions, making coffee, responding to emails, smiling at Daniel's jokes, but inside I was unraveling. Every glance he gave me felt like a lie, every touch like a betrayal. I couldn't decide what hurt more. The fact that he was seeing someone else, or that he thought I was too blind to notice. I began watching him more closely, studying every detail. When his phone buzzed, I paid attention to how quickly he silenced it. When he left for work, I noted the extra minutes he spent getting ready. Once I caught the faintest hint of perfume on his jacket. Not mine, not anything I owned. It was floral and sweet, and the smell clung to my nostrils long after I tossed the jacket back into the closet. I needed answers. Concrete, undeniable proof that what I had seen in his phone wasn't some misunderstanding or a cruel trick my mind was playing on me. So I began following him, not physically at first but digitally. I downloaded a tracking app onto his phone when he wasn't looking. It was easier than I expected. He left it on the kitchen counter one evening while he was unloading groceries. My heart pounded as I worked quickly, my fingers trembling as I entered the password and installed the app. When he returned, I was already leaning casually against the counter, smiling as if nothing had happened. That night, as he slept soundly beside me, I checked the app. His location history told a story he hadn't bothered to share. Lunch breaks at a cafe across town. Late evenings at an apartment complex I didn't recognize. And most damning of all, the hotel. The same one he had marked on his calendar. I couldn't sleep after that. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our marriage in my head. How had we gotten here? When had he stopped loving me? Or had he ever truly loved me at all? The questions circled endlessly, but no answers came. The next day, I decided I needed to see it for myself. I couldn't confront him without more proof, couldn't risk him gaslighting me into thinking I was imagining things. So when he left for work, I waited an hour and then followed his route on the app. Sure enough, he wasn't at his office. He was at the cafe. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Through the window I saw him. He was sitting at a small table by the corner, leaning forward with that soft, tender expression I had seen on the balcony. Across from him was Rachel. She was beautiful. Of course she was. Long dark hair that framed her face perfectly, a laugh that seemed to light up the entire room. She reached across the table, her hand brushing his, and I felt like the ground had opened up beneath me. He smiled at her in a way that he hadn't smiled at me in years, and something inside me broke. I left before they could see me. I couldn't bear to watch anymore. Back in my car, I sat there for what felt like hours, my head resting against the steering wheel as tears streamed down my face. This was it. The confirmation I had been dreading. My husband was in love with someone else. That evening, I didn't say anything to him. I couldn't. I didn't trust myself to speak without breaking down completely. But I knew I couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. So I began preparing for what came next. I called a lawyer the next morning. I didn't tell him everything. Just enough for her to understand the situation. She was kind, calm, and professional, guiding me through the steps I needed to take to protect myself. Bank accounts, joint assets, the house. It was overwhelming, but the thought of staying in this sham of a marriage was worse. Over the next week, I began quietly gathering evidence. Screenshots of his messages with Rachel, photos of his location history, receipts from the hotel. Every piece of the puzzle was another nail in the coffin of our relationship, but it also gave me strength. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. This was real and I deserved better. The final straw came one evening when he came home late. I was sitting on the couch, a book in my lap that I hadn't actually been reading. He walked in, his tie slightly loosened, his hair a little messier than usual. He kissed me on the cheek, muttering something about a long day at work, and then headed to the shower. I followed him, standing just outside the bathroom door as he stripped off his clothes. There it was again. The scent of her perfume. It clung to him like a ghost, a haunting reminder of where he had been and who he had been with. When he came out of the bathroom, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding his phone in my hand. He froze, his expression shifting from confusion to panic in an instant. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. His lies unraveled quickly after that. He tried to deny it at first, of course, but the evidence was too damning. When I mentioned Rachel by name, his face went pale. He stammered through excuses, saying it wasn't what it looked like, that it was complicated, that he loved me. But the words rang hollow. I didn't believe him anymore. By the end of the night, he was the one sleeping on the couch. And I was already drafting my letter to the divorce lawyer. The days after our confrontation were a strange mix of clarity and chaos. He tried to apologize at first, of course. Flowers appeared on the kitchen table one morning. Roses, my favorite, though the gesture felt hollow. He stood in the doorway watching my reaction, as though waiting for me to say that everything was fine, that we could move on. But I didn't. I simply picked up the vase, moved it to the corner of the counter, and went about making my coffee. His face fell, but I didn't care. The man who had once been my everything was now a stranger, and his remorse, if it was real at all, came far too late. He grew desperate in the following days. He started coming home earlier from work, as if being on time could erase the months or years of deceit. He hovered near me in the evenings, offering to help with dinner or clean up afterward, tasks he had ignored for most of our marriage. He even suggested a weekend trip to reconnect, as if a few days away could patch up the gaping wound he'd torn open. I declined without hesitation. The truth was, I didn't want to reconnect. I didn't want to rebuild what he had broken. I wanted to move forward without him. Still, I couldn't ignore the pain. Even as I distanced myself emotionally, the memories crept in, unbidden and unwelcome. I remembered our first date, how he'd nervously fumbled with his keys as he walked me to my car. I remembered the day he proposed, down on one knee in the middle of the park where we had picnicked so many times before. I remembered the way he had looked at me on our wedding day, his eyes filled with a love that I had believed was unshakable. Now I wondered if any of it had been real. One evening, as I sat alone in the bedroom scrolling through old photos on my phone, I stumbled across a picture from last Christmas. It was of the two of us in matching sweaters, smiling in front of the tree. My heart twisted painfully as I realized that even then he had probably been seeing her. The thought was like a knife to the chest, sharp and cold. I threw the phone onto the bed and buried my face in my hands, letting the tears come. But even in the darkest moments there was a spark of something else. A quiet, determined voice in the back of my mind that whispered, "You're stronger than this. You'll get through it." So I started to plan my escape. It wasn't enough to confront him or demand answers. I needed to protect myself, to ensure that when I walked away, I could do so with my head held high and my future intact. I met with the lawyer again, this time armed with all the evidence I had collected. She reviewed everything carefully, nodding with approval as I laid out the details. By the end of the meeting, we had a clear path forward. The next step was harder. I had to begin disentangling my life from his, bit by bit, without tipping him off. I opened a separate bank account and started transferring small amounts of money into it, just enough to go unnoticed. I began looking for apartments, something small but comfortable where I could start over. And I started confiding in a few close friends, people I trusted to support me when the time came. One of those friends, Sarah, was particularly furious on my behalf. "You don't deserve this," she said one night as we sat together in her living room, a bottle of wine between us. "You've given him everything, and this is how he repays you? Unbelievable." Her outrage was comforting in a way, a reminder that I wasn't alone, even as I faced the dissolution of my marriage. Daniel, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the steps I was taking. Or perhaps he was in denial, clinging to the hope that his half-hearted attempts at reconciliation would be enough to win me back. He started leaving little notes for me around the house, on the bathroom mirror, on the fridge, even tucked into my purse. "I love you. I'm sorry. Please don't give up on us." But the words felt like ashes in my hands. their meaning hollow after everything he had done. The breaking point came one Friday evening, 2 weeks after our confrontation. I had been working late, finalizing a project that had kept me distracted from the mess of my personal life. When I arrived home, the house was eerily quiet. I called out his name, but there was no answer. As I moved through the living room, I noticed something on the coffee table. His phone. He had left it there unlocked. I don't know what compelled me to pick it up. Maybe I was looking for closure. Or maybe I just couldn't resist the temptation. Either way, I opened his messages and began scrolling. What I found made my blood run cold. He hadn't stopped talking to her. Despite his apologies, his promises, his desperate attempts to win me back, he was still in contact with Rachel. The messages were as damning as ever, filled with plans to meet and declarations of affection. My hands shook as I read them, the final nail in the coffin of any lingering doubts I might have had. When he came home later that night, I was waiting for him. The phone sat on the coffee table, its screen still displaying the incriminating messages. He froze in the doorway, his face pale as he took in the scene. "We're done," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I'll be moving out by the end of the month. Don't try to stop me." He stammered, reaching for excuses, but I held up a hand to silence him. "Save it, Daniel. I've heard enough lies to last a lifetime." And with that, I walked past him, my heart heavy but resolute. This wasn't the ending I had envisioned for us, but it was the one I needed. It was the first step toward reclaiming my life. The days that followed were a whirlwind of quiet, deliberate action. I stayed in the house, not out of attachment to it or to Daniel, but because I needed time to finalize my plans. Each moment was like walking on the edge of a blade, balancing the need for secrecy with the overwhelming urge to scream at him, to confront him again, to let my anger burst forth in a tidal wave that would leave nothing standing. But I didn't. Instead, I focused on the practical steps of dismantling the life we had built together. The first thing I did was secure a new apartment. It wasn't anything extravagant. A one-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood on the other side of town, but it was mine. The leasing agent, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, smiled warmly as I signed the paperwork. "Starting fresh, huh?" she asked, her tone casual but perceptive. I nodded, unable to trust myself to say more without breaking down. The weight of what I was doing, what I had to do, felt heavier than ever. Back at the house, Daniel seemed to sense that something had shifted. He became more attentive, hovering around me as though trying to close the emotional distance that had grown between us. He asked about my day, offered to cook dinner, even suggested we go out to a movie, something we hadn't done in years. I declined every offer, keeping my responses polite but distant. I couldn't let him pull me back into his orbit, not when I was so close to escaping it. One evening, as we sat in the same room yet felt miles apart, he finally broke the silence. "I know things haven't been easy lately," he said, his voice hesitant. "But I want you to know I'm trying. I really am." I looked at him, studying his face. There was sincerity there, or at least the appearance of it. But I had seen too much, heard too much to believe it anymore. "Trying doesn't change what you've done," I said softly. He flinched as if my words had physically struck him, but he said nothing more. As the move-in date for my new apartment approached, I began packing my things in secret. Each item I placed in a box felt like a small victory, a piece of my life reclaimed from the wreckage of our marriage. I left his belongings untouched, unwilling to sift through the reminders of the man I had once loved. Instead, I focused on what was mine. Clothes, books, photos that didn't include him. Every box I sealed felt like a step closer to freedom. But the hardest part was yet to come. I knew I couldn't just disappear without an explanation, as much as I sometimes wished I could. There had to be a final conversation. A moment where I laid everything out and closed this chapter for good. I dreaded it, rehearsing the words in my head over and over, but I knew it was necessary. The night before I was set to leave, I asked him to sit down with me. He looked surprised, hopeful even. But there was a nervous energy about him as he settled onto the couch across from me. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I'm leaving," I said, the words coming out more firmly than I had expected. "I've found a new place and I'll be moving out tomorrow." His eyes widened and for a moment he was silent. Then he leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice trembling. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. I shook my head, tears welling up but refusing to fall. You had your chance, Daniel. More than one. And you made your choice. I didn't, he started, but I cut him off. Don't lie to me again, I said sharply. I saw the messages. I know about Rachel. I know about the hotel, the lunches, all of it. You betrayed me, Daniel. You made promises to someone else while I was here, holding on to the life we built together. And I won't let you keep dragging me through this. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Whether it was guilt or regret, or just the fear of losing the comfortable life we had shared, I couldn't tell. And honestly, I didn't care anymore. My sympathy for him had run dry. I hope you figure yourself out, I said, standing up. But I can't be a part of this anymore. I deserve better. With that, I walked upstairs to the bedroom, our bedroom though it no longer felt like mine, and closed the door. I didn't sleep much that night, the mix of relief and sadness keeping me awake. But when the morning came, I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was something close to it. A spark of hope. I loaded the boxes into my car while Daniel stayed inside, silent and unseen. As I pulled out of the driveway, I didn't look back. There was no point. My future wasn't behind me. It was waiting ahead, in the quiet apartment that was now my sanctuary. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. The road stretched out before me, full of uncertainty but also full of possibility. And as I drove toward my new life, I promised myself that I would never let anyone take that freedom from me again. The first few weeks in my new apartment were a mix of liberation and loneliness. The space was small but cozy, with bare walls and unpacked boxes that gave it the air of a temporary refuge. At night, the silence felt almost oppressive, a stark contrast to the familiar hum of the house I had left behind. Yet, within that silence was a strange kind of comfort. It was mine. Every corner of this new life belonged to me, untainted by his lies or her presence. I focused on building routines, grounding myself in the ordinary to push back the chaos of the past few months. Mornings started with a cup of coffee by the window, where the view of the bustling city reminded me that life was continuing all around me. Work became my anchor, a way to keep my mind busy and my heart occupied. I threw myself into projects with a determination that surprised even me, staying late at the office just to avoid the emptiness waiting for me at home. Occasionally, I'd catch myself wondering what Daniel was doing. Was he still trying to fix his shattered image of a husband? Or had he fully embraced the life he had clearly chosen? The thoughts crept in during quiet moments, like a phantom lingering at the edges of my mind. But I refused to dwell on them for long. He was no longer my problem, no longer my responsibility. The love I had once poured into him, the trust and hope I had nurtured, was now a void I was learning to fill on my own. One weekend, while unpacking a box of books, I stumbled across our wedding album. I had packed it almost without thinking, a reflexive grab during those frantic days of preparing to leave. Now, sitting cross-legged on the floor of my new living room, I hesitated before opening it. The cover felt heavy in my hands, like the weight of a life I had left behind. When I finally flipped through the pages, the memories came rushing back with a bittersweet intensity. There we were, smiling and carefree, surrounded by friends and family. My dress, his suit, the way his hands trembled as he slipped the ring onto my finger. It all felt like a lifetime ago. I searched my own face in those photos, looking for signs of doubt, for any indication that I might have seen this coming. But all I saw was joy, naive and unguarded. I closed the album with a sharp snap, setting it aside. Those memories belonged to another version of me, one who had believed in forever and trusted too easily. I wasn't that woman anymore. I didn't know who I was yet, not fully, but I knew I was someone stronger now. Someone who had faced the worst and come out the other side, scarred but still standing. As the weeks turned into months, the pain began to dull. It didn't disappear entirely. Grief has a way of lingering in the quiet corners of your heart, but it became more manageable. I started to find joy in small things. A sunny day, a good book, a laugh shared with a coworker. I even began exploring the city on weekends, rediscovering parts of it that I had forgotten in the routine of married life. Each new discovery felt like a step toward reclaiming myself, piece by piece. One evening, while scrolling through my phone, I received a message from Sarah. She had been my rock throughout everything, always ready with a listening ear or a glass of wine when I needed it most. Her text was simple but intriguing. "You free this Friday? I've got a surprise for you." Curious, I agreed, though I wasn't sure I was ready for surprises just yet. When Friday came, she whisked me away to a small art gallery downtown. The space was intimate, filled with vibrant paintings and sculptures that seemed to pulse with life. As we wandered through the exhibits, Sarah nudged me playfully. "You've been hiding away too much. Time to get out there, meet people." I laughed, brushing her off. "I'm not exactly in the market for a new relationship." "Who said anything about a relationship?" she countered. "Sometimes it's just nice to talk to someone who isn't your therapist or your boss." Her words lingered with me as we continued through the gallery. Toward the end of the evening, as we sipped wine and admired the last of the paintings, a man approached us. He was tall, with a kind smile and an easy confidence that put me at ease. His name was Mark, and he was an artist whose work was featured in the exhibit. We struck up a conversation, light and casual, and for the first time in months, I felt the faint stirrings of something I had thought was lost. A spark of connection. Over the following weeks, Mark and I began to see more of each other. It wasn't anything serious, not at first. We met for coffee, went for walks in the park, and talked about everything from art to life to the strange twists of fate that had brought us to that gallery on the same night. He never pressed for details about my past, but he listened when I chose to share. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. With each passing day, I felt myself growing stronger, more certain of who I was and what I wanted. I still carried the scars of my marriage, but they no longer defined me. Instead, they became a testament to my resilience, a reminder that I had survived something that could have broken me. One evening, as I stood on the balcony of my apartment, watching the city lights twinkle like stars, I realized something profound. I wasn't just moving on, I was moving forward. The life I had once envisioned with Daniel was gone, but in its place was something new, something that felt wholly mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace it. Whatever came next, I knew I would face it with an open heart and an unshakable strength. This was my new beginning. Mark became a quiet but steady presence in my life. He wasn't pushy or demanding, and I think that's why I felt so comfortable around him. He understood the delicate nature of my healing, as though he instinctively knew that rushing anything would only scare me away. Instead, he let things unfold naturally, like the slow bloom of a flower in spring. At first, it was just the occasional text or call, little check-ins that made me feel seen without overwhelming me. Over time, our conversations grew deeper, the silences between us more meaningful. One evening, he invited me to his studio. It was in an old brick building downtown, tucked away on a quiet street lined with cafes and boutique shops. When I arrived, the space was exactly what I imagined. Wide windows that let in golden light, canvases leaning against the walls, and the faint scent of paint lingering in the air. He greeted me with a warm smile, his hands speckled with flecks of color. "I've been working on something new," he said, gesturing for me to follow him. I wasn't sure what I expected, but when he pulled the cloth off the canvas, I felt my breath catch. It was abstract, a swirling mix of blues and golds that seemed to pulse with emotion. But there was something familiar in it, too. Something that felt like a reflection of my own journey. "It's about rebuilding," he said quietly, as though reading my thoughts. "About finding beauty in brokenness." His words stayed with me long after I left that night. They echoed in my mind as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Finding beauty in brokenness. It wasn't just the painting he was talking about, it was me. My heart, my life, my future. I had spent so much time mourning what I had lost that I hadn't considered the possibility of what I might gain. Mark and I continued to spend time together, though I was careful to keep things at a pace that felt right for me. There were moments when the fear crept in, the voice in my head warning me not to trust too easily, not to open myself up to the risk of being hurt again. But then there were moments when his kindness and patience melted that fear away, leaving only a quiet sense of hope. One afternoon, as we sat in a park watching the autumn leaves fall, he asked me a question that caught me off guard. "What do you want?" he said, his tone gentle but serious. I hesitated, not because I didn't know the answer, but because saying it out loud made it feel more real. "I want to feel whole again," I finally said. I want to live a life that's mine, not one where I'm constantly trying to fit into someone else's expectations. He nodded as though he understood exactly what I meant. Then that's what you should do, he said simply. His words stayed with me, nudging me to take more control of my life. I started saying yes to things I had once avoided: dinner invitations from friends, weekend trips, even a pottery class that Sarah convinced me to join. Slowly but surely, I began to feel like myself again, or perhaps a new version of myself, one who was stronger and more resilient than before. Eventually, I realized that I hadn't thought about Daniel in weeks. The sharp pain of betrayal had dulled to a distant ache, something that no longer consumed me, but served as a quiet reminder of how far I had come. I even started to let go of the anger, not for his sake, but for my own. Carrying it around felt like dragging a heavy chain, and I was ready to be free of it. One day, out of the blue, I received a text from him. It was short and vague, just a simple, "Hey, how are you?" For a moment I debated whether to respond. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to leave him in the past where he belonged. But another part of me wanted closure, a final chance to say what I needed to say. I wrote back a single sentence: "I'm doing well, and I hope you are too." It wasn't much, but it was enough. He didn't reply, and I didn't expect him to. That small exchange felt like the last thread tying me to him. And as I put my phone down, I felt lighter than I had in months. The next time I saw Mark, I told him about the text. He didn't say much, just nodded thoughtfully, but his presence was enough. It reminded me that I had found something new, something worth holding on to. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that I deserved it. As the seasons changed, so did I. The pain of the past was still a part of me, but it no longer defined me. Instead, it became a part of the tapestry of my life, woven in with the brighter threads of hope, love, and possibility. I didn't know what the future held, but I was no longer afraid of it. I had learned to trust myself again, to find beauty in brokenness, and to embrace the endless possibilities of what came next. The months rolled by, each one bringing subtle changes to my life, as if the universe itself was quietly guiding me toward something better. My apartment, once a collection of sterile white walls and unpacked boxes, began to feel like home. I painted the living room a soft shade of blue, hung photos of places I wanted to visit someday, and filled the bookshelves with novels I had always meant to read but never found the time for. It was still modest, still a work in progress, but every little touch made it feel more like a reflection of who I was becoming. Mark remained a steady presence, though we kept things uncomplicated. We spent time together when it felt right, sharing dinners, attending art shows, or just walking through the city on crisp evenings. There were moments when I caught myself wondering if this could turn into something more, but I never let the thought linger too long. I was still cautious, still rebuilding. He seemed to understand that without me ever needing to explain. It was one of the many things I appreciated about him: his ability to let me set the pace without making me feel like I owed him anything. Meanwhile, my work life flourished in a way I hadn't anticipated. Freed from the emotional weight of my failing marriage, I threw myself into my job with renewed focus. My boss noticed, as did my colleagues, and within 6 months, I found myself being offered a promotion. The title wasn't what excited me. It was the sense of validation, the proof that I was capable and worthy in ways I had doubted for so long. The additional responsibilities kept me busy, but they also gave me a sense of purpose that had been missing for years. Occasionally, Sarah would check in on me, her protective instincts still in overdrive. "You're doing okay, right?" she'd ask during our regular coffee dates, her eyes scanning my face as though looking for cracks. "I'm better than okay," I'd reply honestly. And I was. For the first time in what felt like forever. I wasn't just surviving, I was living. But life, as it always does, has a way of testing you just when you think you found your footing. One evening, as I was leaving the office late, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something compelled me to answer. "Hello," I said hesitantly. There was a pause, and then a voice I hadn't heard in months. "It's me," Daniel said, his tone subdued but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat. Not out of longing or nostalgia, but out of sheer disbelief. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. I've been thinking about you. About us. I wanted to know how you're doing." His words were tentative, almost apologetic, but I could hear the undercurrent of something else. Regret. Maybe, or desperation. "I'm doing fine," I said curtly. "Why are you calling, Daniel? We said everything we needed to say months ago." "I know," he replied quickly. "I know. But I can't stop thinking about how things ended. I made mistakes, huge mistakes, and I hate the way I hurt you. I needed to tell you that." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind him of all the pain he had caused. But another part of me, the part that had worked so hard to move on, felt only pity. He was still stuck in the wreckage of our past, while I had already begun to build something new. "I appreciate the apology," I said finally, my voice calm but firm. "But it doesn't change anything. I've moved on, Daniel. I hope you can too." There was a long silence on the other end and then a quiet, "I'm glad you're doing well. You deserve to be happy." "Thank you," I said simply, and then I ended the call. As I walked to my car, the conversation replayed in my mind. It felt like the final chapter of a book I had been ready to close for a long time. His words didn't stir up the pain I had expected. Instead, they brought a strange sense of closure. I realized then that I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad either. I was free. That night I told Mark about the call. He listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. When I finished, he reached across the table and took my hand, his touch warm and steady. "You handled it well," he said simply. "You've come so far." His words filled me with a quiet pride. I had come far. Further than I ever thought possible in those dark days after leaving Daniel. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, I felt ready to face whatever it held. In the weeks that followed, I found myself thinking less and less about the past. Instead, I focused on the present, the friends who had supported me, the work that inspired me, and the possibilities that lay ahead. I started volunteering at a local shelter on weekends, something I had always wanted to do but never made time for. The experience grounded me, reminding me of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of kindness, even in the face of hardship. One crisp autumn evening, as Mark and I strolled through the park, he turned to me with a question that caught me off guard. "What's next for you?" he asked, his tone light but curious. I thought about it for a moment, the cool breeze rustling the leaves around us. "I don't know," I admitted. "But for the first time in a long time, I'm excited to find out." He smiled and we continued walking, the city lights twinkling in the distance. The future stretched out before me wide and open, and for the first time, it felt like something I could embrace. The more time passed, the more I realized how much had changed within me. It wasn't just the freedom I felt in being away from Daniel, though that was certainly a part of it. It was something deeper, a kind of awakening I hadn't expected. I was no longer defined by what had happened to me. Instead, I was carving out a life on my own terms, piece by piece, day by day. Mark remained a steady presence, but I never felt like I was relying on him to fill the gaps in my life. That was one of the most important lessons I had learned. That healing and happiness couldn't come from someone else. They had to start within me. He understood that, and his respect for my boundaries only deepened my appreciation for him. We spent time together because it felt good, not because either of us needed the other to feel whole. One evening, as we sat in my living room with takeout containers spread out on the coffee table, Mark asked me a question that made me pause. "Do you ever think about what you want your life to look like 5 or 10 years from now?" I leaned back, considering his words. It was the kind of question that would have terrified me a year ago, when my future felt like a blank slate smeared with uncertainty. But now it felt more like an invitation. "I don't have a concrete plan," I admitted. "But I know I want it to be a life that feels authentic. I want to keep doing work that matters to me, stay connected to the people I care about, and keep growing. I don't think I need all the answers right now." He smiled at that, his eyes warm and thoughtful. "That sounds like a good start." After he left that night, I found myself thinking about his question again. What did I want my life to look like? For so long, my identity had been tied to my role as Daniel's wife, and when that ended, it had taken everything in me to figure out who I was without him. Now, I was starting to see that the possibilities were endless. I wasn't bound by anyone else's expectations or limitations. For the first time, my future belonged entirely to me. I decided to start small, focusing on the things I could control. I signed up for a photography class, something I had always been curious about but never made time for. I started exploring different neighborhoods on the weekends, finding hidden gems, cafes, bookstores, parks, that became little pockets of joy in my routine. I even reached out to an old college friend I hadn't spoken to in years, reconnecting over shared memories and laughter. But the biggest change came when I received an unexpected email from my boss. It was an offer to lead a new project, a long-term initiative that would involve traveling to different cities, meeting with clients, and overseeing a team. It was an incredible opportunity, one that could significantly advance my career. But it also meant stepping out of my comfort zone in a big way. I spent days thinking it over, weighing the pros and cons. Part of me was hesitant, unsure if I was ready for such a major commitment. But another part of me, the part that had survived heartbreak and rebuilt a life from the ground up, knew that I couldn't let fear hold me back. This was my chance to take a leap, to prove to myself that I was capable of more than I had ever imagined. When I finally accepted the offer, the excitement and nervousness mingled in equal measure. Mark was one of the first people I told, and his reaction was nothing but supportive. "You're going to do amazing," he said, his confidence in me unwavering. "I can't wait to hear all about it." The project started a few weeks later, and from the very beginning, it pushed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. There were long hours, difficult decisions, and moments of doubt, but there were also incredible highs. I thrived on the challenge, discovering a side of myself I hadn't tapped into before. I was strong, capable, and independent, and it felt good. Traveling gave me a fresh perspective too. Each city I visited was like a new chapter, filled with unfamiliar faces and experiences. I kept a journal, jotting down little observations and reflections as I went. Over time, those entries began to paint a picture of a woman who had grown in ways she never thought possible. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. One evening, as I sat in a quiet hotel room overlooking a bustling cityscape, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old photos. There was one from a year ago, taken just days after I had moved into my apartment. I looked at my face in the picture, the uncertainty in my eyes, and compared it to the woman I had become. The difference was staggering. That version of me had been afraid, unsure of what lay ahead. This version was bold, unafraid to take risks, and deeply proud of how far she had come. Mark and I stayed in touch throughout my travels, exchanging texts and calls whenever our schedules aligned. He never once made me feel guilty for being away, never demanded more than I could give. Instead, he cheered me on from a distance, always reminding me that I was capable of anything I set my mind to. Our relationship remained a source of comfort and joy, but it never defined me. I was building a life that was mine first and foremost, and that foundation made everything else possible. As the project drew to a close, and I prepared to return home, I felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything I had experienced before. This journey had been about more than just work. It had been about proving to myself that I could step into the unknown and come out stronger on the other side. I had faced challenges, made mistakes, and grown in ways I hadn't anticipated, and every moment of it had been worth it. When I walked back into my apartment for the first time in months, it felt like a homecoming. The familiar scent of lavender from the candle I had left behind, the sunlight streaming through the windows, the cozy blankets draped over the couch. It was all a reminder of the life I had built with my own hands. A life that was full of promise and possibility. A life that was mine. Settling back into my apartment after the months away felt like a deep exhale. A moment to appreciate how much I had grown. The silence that had once felt so suffocating now felt peaceful, like a canvas waiting to be painted. I wandered through the rooms that had become my sanctuary, noticing little details I'd almost forgotten. The way the sunlight caught the edge of the bookshelf, the faint scent of lavender lingering from the candle I'd left on the coffee table. It was home in a way that no place ever had been before. Unpacking my suitcase, I found the journal I had kept throughout my travels. I flipped through its pages, revisiting the thoughts I had scribbled down in airports and hotel rooms, the quiet moments when I reflected on how far I had come. Each entry felt like a time capsule, a snapshot of the woman I was becoming. There were passages filled with doubt and exhaustion, but they were outweighed by the moments of triumph, of discovering new strengths I hadn't known I possessed. I sat down with a cup of tea and let myself read through the entries page by page. One stood out to me, written after a particularly challenging meeting in Chicago where I had been forced to make a difficult decision. I had written, "Today I learned that strength doesn't mean not being afraid. It means acting in spite of the fear. It means trusting yourself, even when you're not sure you're ready." As I read those words, I realized they had become a mantra of sorts, a truth I carried with me into every new experience. Mark came over later that evening, bringing a bottle of wine and his usual easy smile. He had been my biggest cheerleader throughout the project, always quick to remind me of my capabilities when I doubted myself. As we sat together on the couch, catching up on everything that had happened while I was away, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for his presence in my life. He never tried to overshadow my independence or make my success about him. Instead, he celebrated it alongside me, content to be a part of my journey without trying to define it. "Any big plans now that you're back?" he asked, swirling his wine glass thoughtfully. I shrugged, a smile tugging at the corners of my lips. "I don't know yet. I think I want to take some time to just enjoy where I am. I've been so focused on the next step for so long that I haven't really paused to appreciate how far I've come." "That sounds like exactly what you need," he said. "And knowing you, you'll find something amazing to do next when the time is right." His confidence in me was unwavering, and it gave me the courage to trust in myself even more. That night, as we sat together talking about art, life, and everything in between, I felt a quiet contentment settle over me. It wasn't the giddy excitement of a new beginning or the relief of escaping a painful past. It was something deeper, more enduring. It was the kind of peace that comes from knowing you're on the right path. In the weeks that followed, I allowed myself to slow down for the first time in years. I spent lazy mornings sipping coffee by the window, watching the world go by. I took long walks through the city, rediscovering its hidden corners and vibrant energy. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in ages, sharing laughter and stories over dinners that stretched late into the night. Each moment felt like a small celebration of the life I was creating, a reminder that I didn't need to rush to the next milestone to feel fulfilled. One weekend, on a whim, I decided to take a solo trip to a coastal town I had always wanted to visit. The idea of traveling alone would have terrified me a year ago, but now it felt like an adventure, a chance to spend time with myself and see the world on my own terms. I booked a quaint little bed and breakfast overlooking the ocean and packed a bag with nothing but a few essentials and my camera. The trip was everything I had hoped for and more. I spent my days wandering along the shore, the salty breeze tangling my hair as I collected smooth stones and shells. I explored local shops and cafes, chatting with strangers who shared stories of their own journeys. At night, I sat on the balcony of my room, watching the waves crash against the rocks below and writing in my journal. It was during one of those quiet evenings that I realized something profound. I was happy. Not just content or at peace, but truly deeply happy. And it wasn't because of anyone else, it was because of me. When I returned home, I carried that happiness with me, letting it infuse every part of my life. I threw myself into new projects at work, excited by the challenges and opportunities they brought. I continued to spend time with Mark, our bond growing stronger with each passing day. And I kept making time for myself, whether it was through quiet evenings at home or spontaneous adventures to places I had never been before. As the seasons changed, so did I. The scars of my past were still there, but they no longer felt like wounds. They had become a part of my story, a testament to my resilience and growth. I had learned to embrace them, not as a source of pain, but as a reminder of how far I had come and how much I was capable of overcoming. One evening, as I stood on the balcony of my apartment, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. For the heartbreak that had forced me to rebuild. For the friends who had stood by me when I needed them most. For Mark, whose quiet support had helped me find my footing again. But most of all for myself, for choosing to move forward, to let go, and to believe in the possibility of something better. The road ahead was still unwritten, but but I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I knew that whatever challenges came my way, I had the strength to face them. My life was my own, and it was beautiful in its imperfection, full of promise and endless possibilities. For the first time in a long time I felt truly free. And I knew deep in my heart that the best was yet to come. As the months turned into a year, the sense of freedom I had fought so hard to reclaim grew into something even greater. Fulfillment. Life no longer felt like a series of hurdles to overcome but a rich, expansive journey filled with opportunities to grow, love, and simply be. I embraced every moment, knowing that even the quiet days of routine held a kind of magic. Mark and I continued our steady rhythm, and one day, without much fanfare, it became clear that we were more than two people finding comfort in each other's company. We had become partners, not in the way I had once imagined love to be, a whirlwind of passion and idealized perfection, but in a way that felt deeper, steadier. He didn't complete me, as I once might have hoped a partner would. Instead, he complemented me, adding richness to a life I had already learned to fill on my own. One evening, as we sat on the balcony of my apartment, the same balcony where I had once looked out at the city and wondered if I could ever start over, I realized how far I had come. The pain of the past was no longer a weight I carried. Instead, it was part of the foundation upon which I had built something stronger. I don't know if I've ever thanked you, I said, turning to Mark. The golden light of the setting sun illuminated his face as he looked at me with quiet curiosity. For being patient. For letting me find my way without rushing me. For believing in me. His smile was soft, the kind that held more meaning than words ever could. You didn't need me to believe in you, he said. You've always had that strength in you. I'm just lucky to witness it. The conversation stayed with me long after the sun had set, a reminder of how much I had gained by letting go of the life I thought I wanted. I had learned that love wasn't about losing yourself in someone else. It was about finding someone who celebrated the person you already were. And in Mark I had found that. As the years went on, life continued to evolve in ways I never could have predicted. My career flourished, taking me to places I had only dreamed of. My friendships deepened, and my world grew richer with the connections I nurtured. Mark and I built a life together, not out of need but out of choice, and it was one rooted in mutual respect, trust, and genuine joy. One particularly quiet morning, as I sat in the cozy living room of the home we eventually bought together, I opened my journal. It had become a constant companion over the years, a place to reflect and dream. I flipped through its pages, skimming the words of a woman who had once felt broken and lost. But now, as I wrote the final entry, I realized that chapter of my life had long since ended. I'm proud of her, the woman who walked away, who chose herself when it felt like the hardest thing in the world. Because of her, I'm here now living a life that's full, honest, and mine. If I could tell her anything, it would be this: it gets better. The pain doesn't last forever. And the happiness you'll find on the other side is worth every step you take to get there. I closed the journal and set it aside, looking around at the home I had built, the love I had found, and the peace I had earned. The journey wasn't always easy, but it had led me here, to a life I wouldn't trade for anything. And as I watched the morning sunlight stream through the window, I knew that the best stories are the ones we write for ourselves, one day at a time.